Hello everyone, welcome to Behind the Numbers Around the World, an eMarketer podcast made possible by mParticle. It's Tuesday, May the 31st, and I'm your host, UK Principal Analyst Bill Fisher, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Around the World with the Era of Uncertainty. Welcome folks to a Behind the Numbers show that takes you around the world looking at what various countries are doing in the worlds of commerce, media and advertising. Each month, I give you a quick-fire global news recap, giving you insight into some of the biggest stories that we've seen around the world in the past month. Then I speak with a couple of our seasoned specialists to get their take on the main theme for today's show, which is all about the current state we find ourselves in with war, inflation, supply chain pressures, the list goes on. We'll be asking, how is China's influence on global supply chains affecting current world issues?
With this kind of lockdown for 2 months, we're seeing major impact in production, shipping. That has huge implication on the way we're able to get our Teslas on our iPhones, and also exacerbated the chip shortage as well.
What is community group buying, and why is it a hot topic in China? And the most important one, to my mind at least, what does a beer bottle shortage in Germany signal for the economy?
This is exactly the kind of thing that begins to appear when this very complex range of factors comes into play. The problem arises because of the energy it takes to manufacture the bottles. If you think of the high temperatures needed to melt the glass, form the glass.
So, before I introduce my first guest, let's dig into some of the biggest stories from around the globe this month in our segment 3 in 3. I have 3 minutes to cover 3 of the most interesting news stories we've seen in Around the World Towers this month. The timer is set. Let's go. For the first story, we're in China, and who hasn't heard of 520 Day? I hadn't, that's for sure. It refers to May 20th, hence 520, and is the unofficial digital-first Valentine's Day in China. In Mandarin, the pronunciation of 520 sounds very similar to I love you, apparently. How sweet. It's certainly sweet for luxury retailers. According to Vogue Business Research, in 2021, more luxury brands took part in 520 Day than the traditional Western-inspired Valentine's Day, 91 to 72 in fact. But wait, there's another day to consider. Many industry watchers see 520 Day as a warm-up event for 618 Day, which was originated by JD.com to compete with Alibaba's Singles Day sales event on November 11th. No surprise, 618 Day falls on June 18th and is the second largest shopping day in China behind Singles Day, likely the second largest shopping day in the world, in fact. According to China data analyst firm Xintun, it was worth $90 billion in 2021. Big numbers for these numbered shopping days. For the second story, we're heading to Brazil via the US, where Elon Musk allegedly doesn't own any property and couch surfs at his friends' houses. Anyway, we all know about Musk's protracted and potentially not happening acquisition of Twitter. Well, one man who is desperate for the deal to go ahead is President of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. As quoted by Reuters earlier this month, Bolsonaro hailed the billionaire's bid for Twitter, saying it was like a breath of hope. He might well say that. After all, the far-right nationalist has had plenty of run-ins with social media platforms in the past, which have repeatedly taken measures to remove misinformation peddled by him. Musk was in Brazil earlier this month to meet with the president, and Mr. Bolsonaro was delighted, describing the relationship as one that would surely soon end in marriage. Maybe they should wait for 520 Day next year. And for our third story, we're in Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, in fact, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is having severe implications for the region. Russia itself is likely to see inflation reach an eye-watering 18 to 23% this year. That's according to the Central Bank of Russia. In Central and Eastern Europe, meanwhile, we've provided some scenario-based forecasting for our latest ad spending predictions, where we had initially forecast ad spending growth of around 8% in the region for 2022. We now expect a decline of either 23% in our moderate scenario or 32% in a severe scenario. Some big names in the advertising space have publicly lamented the effects the war has been having on their businesses. Meta said the Ukraine war hurt its Q1 2022 results, citing a further deceleration in growth because of lost revenue in Russia and reduction in advertising demand both within Europe and outside the region. Meta also suffered because it stopped taking ads from Russian companies globally. Meanwhile, Snap said the advertiser concerns over the war contributed to a slowdown in its Q1 revenue growth, and its Q2 doesn't look good either. Of course, business should be the least of our concerns in this terrible situation, and our thoughts are with those directly affected by this terrible war. That's my 3 in 3 this month, and we'll definitely be touching on the impact of the war in Ukraine later in the podcast. But first, we're going to head to China. Man-Chung is our research analyst for China and Japan. Hi, Man-Chung.
Hey, Bill. Thanks for having me.
It's always a pleasure to have you, and you know that you have the dubious honour this month of trying to guess my Britishism of the month. That's a word or phrase that is sometimes understood in the UK. I'm increasingly finding that's not the case, but less understood elsewhere. You haven't had a go for a while, so I think you're due. Anyway, let's get straight into it. Today's word is lurgy, L-U-R-G-Y, or sometimes it's spelled L-U-R-G-I, but the word is lurgy. Do you know what that means?
Yeah, as a former Hong Kong resident, I think I should be pretty confident in this kind of test, right? So it looks to me like some kind of cartoon character, like Fergie, This is lurgy, right? It's a British form of children's show. Am I right?
I really like where you've gone with that one. It's completely wrong, but I like the journey you took to get there. It actually means an unspecified or indeterminate illness.
You got me on that one.
Yeah,
Bill.
It's an interesting one, right? The etymology of this one is actually relatively recent, and it's quite fun. It was first used in a 1954 radio broadcast in the UK of a comedy show called The Goon Show. The Goons were made up of British comedians Peter Sellers, Harry Seacombe, Michael Bentine, and Spike Milligan. And they created a sketch in which a character had to deal with a national outbreak of a highly dangerous, highly contagious, and highly fictitious disease called the dreaded lurgy. How prophetic. Anyway, it's since come to be used as a catch-all term for illness. As an aside, Spike Milligan has one of the greatest epithets on a gravestone that I've ever seen in my life. It's in Irish Gaelic for some reason. I'm going to have a go at this, so apologies for any Irish Gaelic speakers listening in. It says, Dutch me lat go rave me brocha, and that translates as, I told you I was ill, which is quite an understatement, I think. Anyway, we have had the worst of all lurgies in the past couple of years, but just as it looks like we might be getting a handle on things, something else comes around the corner. We've got war, inflation, tech crashes. We are in quite the era of uncertainty. And Insider Intelligence recently published a report with that exact title. So we're going to take a regional focus on that theme and head first of all to China to take a look at what role it's playing in this uncertainty and how it's being affected. So, Man-Chung, I thought we could start by looking at issues with supply chains, because China has an oversized influence on global supply. It's the world's largest exporter and producer of industrial goods. It's got 7 of the world's top 10 container ports. So when things go wrong with supply in China, you can bet your bottom dollar there's going to be a global impact. What's going on?
Yeah, so if we all remember, the pandemic started at the beginning of 2020 or so, right? Initially, China had a rough time containing the pandemic, but after the initial wave, it did pretty well. It was able to keep new cases down to the hundreds or even lower for the better part of 2 years. But since the beginning of this year in March, things changed drastically because of the Omicron variant. It's much more transmittable, and it just has proven to be much more difficult to contain. So we were seeing new cases spiking to, the thousands in China. So the previous measures of lockdown and testing everyone was much easier and much more effective. But when it comes to the Omicron variant, it was just going out of control. So they decided to lock down the entire city of Shanghai, which has a population of 25 million, or roughly 3 times the size of New York City, for not a week, not 2 weeks, but we're talking about 2 months. So people were, kept in the houses, weren't able to leave their home. Roads were blocked. Police set up checkpoints that shut down all types of production, shipping. They're just slowly easing into reopening, and they're planning to officially lift the lockdown on June 1st, right? So retail stores, the larger ones, are allowed to open up to 75% capacity. But, with this kind of lockdown for 2 months, we're seeing major impact in production, shipping. That has huge implication on the way we're able to get our Teslas on our iPhones, and also exacerbated the chip shortage as well.
Yeah, and Shanghai, I think I'm right in saying it's one of the biggest container ports in the world.
The number one container
yeah.
port by volume.
Okay, so a lockdown that long is obviously going to have an issue. I think you mentioned Apple there. There's been some talk of some global companies diversifying away from China a little bit and having less reliance on it. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, it's a complex issue that people have been wrestling with for the longest time. And I think, look at China with the costs of labor rising in recent years. Some of these companies were already moving some of the operations overseas, especially the lower end ones, and, you still can't find this type of comprehensive ecosystem for manufacturing that you see in China anywhere in the world. So I believe that, a lot of the major manufacturing capacity will still stay at home. And also, just the allure of having the world's biggest consumer market, or soon to be biggest consumer market, will help cap some of the manufacturing at home. But I see that some of perhaps the lower end manufacturing will go to countries like, in Southeast Asia, and building additional manufacturing capacity closer to their home. But I think China will definitely retain the bulk of the manufacturing that they already have.
Okay, talking about the consumer market, I want to look at consumers for a minute and consumer sentiment. So I mentioned 520 day in the intro there. And the data I gave was from 2021, but 2021 seemed to be quite a healthy year for retail sales on that day. Is it business as normal in China? I mean, not business as normal because there's still COVID around, but as normal as it can be. Are consumers still spending?
Yeah, so early part of last year, the rebound was really healthy. We were seeing strong rebound, but towards the end of the year, it sort of started dipping a little bit, and still healthy, but, with the lockdown, we are seeing a huge dive in retail sales since March, and also in April as well. I believe retail sales in April was down 11% or something like that. So it's hurting. I think everyone is hurting because of this lockdown, especially small businesses. This is also a time when unemployment in China is ticking up. Traditionally, new college graduates could count on securing jobs at these local tech giants, but right now, these giants are hurting from China's own tech crackdown. And if the large-scale pandemic lockdowns continue, the picture could get worse. On the other hand, it could also turn around for the better quickly when things reopen. The hope is that China will relax its stringent approach to dealing with COVID. So we just have to find ways to embrace this age of uncertainty.
Yeah, talk to me about community group buying, because you told me about this. I'd never heard of it before. What is it and why is it happening?
Yeah, so during the lockdown, especially, traffic was restricted, foot traffic was restricted, people weren't allowed to move about as they want to. So essentially, to restrict traffic into, let's say, a residential compound. Before the pandemic, this type of community group buying was already growing really fast because it's a different type of model. It cuts costs for the operators and for consumers as well. It's a type of bulk buying, but essentially the product gets shipped to one central hub near the neighborhood, and it gets distributed by a group leader, they would call it, who is responsible for coordinating the orders from the residents in the compound. So in doing so, they are putting in huge volume of orders, and so the price would come down for them, right? So under the pandemic, they're able to just have one bulk shipment shipped to the compound or nearby and have people picked up from that location. So it's helped restrict the traffic instead of regular grocery where you're having perhaps hundreds of delivery men coming into your compound, right?
Interesting model. Also, Man-Chung, it's always so fascinating to hear about what's going on in China. But that's all we've got time for this segment, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for chatting, though.
Always a pleasure, Bill.
That's the end of part 1 of our podcast for today. We're going to hear from our sponsor now, but don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with part 2, because that's what comes after part 1.
At the end of the day, your customer has to be at the center of everything you do. This starts with the right customer data strategy as well as the right foundation to solve the challenges that typically inhibit success, such as data quality, data governance, and connectivity. mParticle is your real-time customer data infrastructure that helps you accelerate your data strategy by cleansing, visualizing, and integrating your customer data from anywhere to anywhere. Ultimately, better data leads to better decisions, better customer experiences, and better outcomes. See why the best brands choose mParticle. Go to www.mparticle.com.
Welcome back, and welcome to our next guest. Karin von Abrams is our principal analyst for Western Europe. Hi, Karin.
Hi, Bill. Great to join you today.
Good to have you. You got away with the Britishism this month. You must have been happy about that.
Well, I mean, inevitably it's one I knew, but let's not go into that.
Sod's law, right? The one that you knew I didn't ask you. Anyway, maybe next time I'll give you a gimme. Okay, it's time to turn our focus to Europe anyway. I want to start by quoting some stats from a piece of research from programmatic research technology company Lucid. It found that 67% of UK consumers were aware of the increased cost of living and were already making changes to their lifestyle as a result. A further 89% thought that brands had a role to play in helping consumers through this crisis. So let's start with this, the cost of living crisis. It seems to be very real in the UK. It's all over the media. Is the picture the same across the rest of Europe, or does it vary country by country?
It does vary to some extent country by country. I can throw a few stats at you. In France, core consumer prices rose 2.5% year on year in February. There was also a rise in January. That was the steepest increase since June of 1993. According to a government source. In the Netherlands, the annual rate of inflation was nearly 10% higher in April this year than in April 2021. In Poland, inflation hit 12.4% in April this year. And then we can talk also about the fact that in most countries, interest rates are going up. So we have inflation, we have the supply chain issues that you raised with Man-Chung, and people who, of course, who have loans taken out on property or on a car or something like that. This is all getting to be a really big squeeze for a lot of people in Europe.
Yeah, we'll come back to supply chain issues in a moment. I want to stick with consumer sentiment because I asked Man-Chung about consumer sentiment in China. We put together our retail spending forecasts, and we work with a forecasting team in the UK, for example. We look at ONS, Office for National Statistics. They track retail spending on a month-by-month basis. And in the UK, they actually saw growth of 1.4% month on month in April. It's a little bit up and down, though. So in March, it was actually down by about 1%. But broadly speaking, for the first 3 quarters of this year, comparing that with the first 3 months of last year, things didn't look too bad. Obviously, there's different strata of people in society. Is this cost of living crisis more real for certain people than others? And are these others helping to keep retail afloat, so to speak?
I think that's probably quite an accurate view. There are people, obviously, who retain more disposable income, can make discretionary purchases. Equally, I would say, you pointed to the up and down nature of these figures. I think certainly across Europe, immediately after the invasion of Ukraine in late February, there was a great shock, as you can imagine, and consumer confidence really plummeted, as did ad spend, curiously, in the month following that. So that would be the month of March. By April, I think, sadly, the war in Ukraine starts to become more a regular feature of something that we are all taking into account. We're trying to absorb this news. Equally, there is pent-up demand. And also spring is coming along. So with the change in the weather again, and certainly in most of Europe, people are out and about more than they had been, perhaps during the winter, and in spite of the fact that COVID is still around. So a number of factors that play there, I would say.
Yeah, an interesting side note here. Via Twitter, consumer journalist Harry Wallop, he spoke about how a supermarket executive told him that the best barometer for a cost of living crisis is head to the baby aisle in the supermarket. So the baby food or the diaper aisle. And if you find random items dumped in there, then it's a sure sign that we're in trouble, because people are walking down the baby aisle and they're having to make a decision there and then. What do? Do I have these tea bags or do I feed the baby? And then obviously the baby wins and they ditch the tea bags in the baby food aisle. I don't know about you. I haven't been down to the supermarket for a while. I get everything delivered, but that's something to look out for. So let's take a look at the supply chain issues now. We looked at it in depth from China. How is that playing out in Europe? Any specific issues over here?
To a great extent, the problems are the same because so many supply chains are global. So many of the products that are for sale in Europe come from abroad and not few from China, for example. So like every other region, Europe is affected. To a significant degree, though, as you can imagine, it is the region closest to Ukraine and to Russia, and both the psychological and the practical effects are arguably in some areas felt most here. That's not just in products, that's also, for example, in the supply of gas and electricity, much of which comes to many European countries from Russia, as we know. And the disruption to that, the arguments about having an embargo on that, not buying from Russia, have really constrained both consumer confidence and, more importantly, business. So yes, supply chain and things like the chip shortage, still a problem. Let's not forget also that in terms of shipping by land, not to mention by sea, there's still a shortage of truck drivers, or as we say, lorry drivers in the UK, and fuel costs are going up. So a real squeeze on all retailers and all brands because all of these incremental phases of the supply chain are costing more.
Yeah, you mentioned a squeeze from the fuel side of things and energy as well. Now, tell me this ain't true, but this knock-on effect from the energy crisis, that there's a beer bottle shortage in Germany. What's happening there?
This is exactly the kind of thing that begins to appear when this very complex range of factors comes into play. The German Brewers Association in the past couple of weeks has announced that there may well be a shortage of beer bottles to put beer into this year. And this is bad news for anyone, and especially for people who associate summer with, a nice drink of something cold. But the problem arises because of the energy it takes to manufacture the bottles. If you think of the high temperatures needed to melt the glass, form the glass. In fact, the association did say for people who didn't pre-order bottles last year, for example, they're now costing 80% more than they did last year. And again, there's a shortage of people driving the trucks to bring the beer around, but that may put pressure on ad spending if you think there's less beer being bottled and, taken to the shelves in the store. On the other hand, this same survey revealed that actually bottle shortages are likely to affect the small and medium-sized breweries a great deal more than the larger ones. The larger ones are more likely to have pre-ordered and to have the wherewithal one way or another, either storage or money to bring in the bottles, even though they cost more. So they will likely do well, but variety in the market will be diminished because of smaller breweries not being able to cope and having to, well, who knows, they're probably trying very rapidly to replan now around these emerging situations.
What are we going to drink out of? Plastic bags I saw the other day.
Indeed. Well, that's been, and it's a shame Man-Chung didn't talk about drinking beer out of plastic in China because that's been on the menu for a few years now. But who knows? It may be coming to Europe. Too early to tell.
Karin, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thanks very much for taking some time out to speak with me today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Always fun to join you.
And that's it for this month's edition of Around the World. Thanks again to my guests, Man-Chung and Karin. And thanks to you for listening to my butchering of Irish Gaelic as well. Tune in tomorrow for the next Reimagining Retail podcast, where Sarah Lebo will be joined by Andrew Lipsman and Susie David-Carnian talking about how brands can become cool again. If you want to ask us any questions, you can, of course, email us at podcast@emarketer.com. Until we meet again, I wish you all a happy and healthy month ahead, free of the dreaded lurgy. I hope to see you next time for another episode of Behind the Numbers Around the World. Bye for now.